The County Township of Telesir. Local transportium junction. The Hall of Ingress. Local time 13:05 hours. Emma. A single step forward. That was all it took for the world to turn upside down. Whereas the portal connecting the Academy to Elisir was instantaneous and more door-like, with a single step seemingly linking 2 points in space, the transportium instead had a noticeable gap, a tangible space between the two gates that broke the seamless connection. But that wasn't the only thing it broke, as both my perception and the EV's sensors were abruptly pushed to the breaking point. We crossed what I could only describe as a threshold, one that sat in an unfathomable darkness between two flat openings in space. We were compressed. Impossibly so, as behind us stood Stips, and in front of us was Telesir. Both worlds were framed like a painting that stretched on in all axes but death. Yet it was this in-between that physics, as I understood it, just seemingly gave up, as despite us currently crossing what felt like two-dimensional space, there existed an infinite abyss beyond the frame of the two bright worlds we were sandwiched between. This was outright dread-inducing, as both agoraphobia and claustrophobia threatened to crush me from both sides. The same sense of primal fear that came with my first untethered space Eva hit me. Yet at the same time, that fear of drifting into the infinite darkness, both above and below us, was tempered by the abruptness of it all. Because according to the Eevee, the whole transit, if you could even call it that, took just a handful of seconds. 2.23 seconds to be precise. To travel what was ostensibly a greater distance than that of our entire journey by conventional means thus far. I would say this was beyond humanity's capabilities, but the warp drive made that point completely and utterly moot. Still, this method of travel negated distances. Whilst warp travel quite literally propelled you, and the composite, cargo, weapons and furniture around you faster than light, it was unfair to really compare the two. The Nexians, as magic seemed to naturally encourage, simply cheated. Or more fairly, they simply took the path of least resistance available to them. Humanity, on the other hand, once again brute-forced our way to achieving more of the same, with the added bonus of the industry and infrastructure that sprang up to both allow for and maintain such a dedicated intersolar apparatus. Two sides of a very different coin, I mumbled to myself, not realizing how dumb that analogy sounded until I heard it vocalized. "You doing alright there, Emma?" Thalman asked, as he somehow managed to order the Kelpie to gently nudge me on the shoulder. Yeah, I'm just... "Not used to transportium travel?" Thalman chuckled boisterously. "I can't say I am, no," I responded, with a dry snicker. "Don't worry, you're in the same boat," he spoke reassuringly. "As you?" "Ancestors, no! I was actually referring to them." Thalman's smile quickly turned mischievous, before pointing at more than a handful of elves, satyrs, baxi, kobolds, and dwarves currently leaning, facing, or outright collapsed next to a brick and plaster wall, all in varying states of sickness and nausea. Behind them were carts upon carts of tarped-over wagons, livestock, and just about every type of produce one could imagine. I narrowed my eyes at the scene, cocking my head as I completely forgot about Thalman's jab, and focused more on the sick room next to us along with its implications. "Sorry if that was a bit of a low jab, Emma," Thalman suddenly interrupted, moving to clear his throat with one hand and using the other to rub the back of his neck. "What? No, I was just thinking." "About?" The wolf cocked his head. "Why they all seem to be so sick, and in fact why there's a whole dedicated sign room for..." I narrowed my eyes, as the Eevee was quick to zoom onto a sign written in common, which was promptly translated to a questionable degree of accuracy. Near-death experience. I read the translated text word by questionable word, cocking my head at Thalman as I did so. This was enough to get the prince to very nearly lose it, as his eyes lit up and his hands went to stifle what would have been a catastrophic laugh, especially out in public. That's a very literal way of putting it, Emma. Your command of High Nexian never ceases to amaze." He shook his head, calming down, before finally addressing the elephant in the room. "It's simple, really. They're weak fielders." He spoke matter-of-factly. "I think we touched on this a long while back, but commoners tend to be more susceptible to mana sickness when there's a sudden and significant surge in latent mana. The transportium, despite being a near instantaneous realm of traversal, is one such environment that qualifies as such. This is why even the most seasoned of couriers will still require the services of the... The prince paused to quickly shake his head, stifling another laugh. Near-death room. Right, I acknowledged, just as 2 elves in plate armor approached us. My lord? My lady? The lead elf addressed us curtly, bowing ever so slightly in the process. We have been informed of your arrival. However, this is where our courtesy ends, he continued ominously, before gesturing behind us. I would humbly request that your lordships move forward, for a queue is quickly forming. The rear-view cameras quickly popped in to show a veritable backlog of carts and wagons already piling up behind us, prompting us to move along swiftly with a whir and a clop. However, I couldn't help but to wonder exactly where the glut of traffic came from, especially since that there was nobody else waiting to use the transportium on Sips's side of the... Then it hit me. This portal probably didn't just service Sips. If the continuously arriving cars were any indication, the framed portal behind us, and indeed other similar ones to the left and right of it, was more than likely coming from all across the kingdom. The sheer logistics of this whole operation lit a fire in the furnace of my lore-obsessed heart as I started to finally take note of every detail of this place. This particular transportium junction wasn't at all the small and rather quaint terminal building we just entered from Sips, where passenger and cargo alike cohabited a cross between a warehouse and a depressing pre-22nd century bus depot. No. Instead, what we found ourselves in was a masterfully crafted work of wrought iron and steel, framed by brick and plaster walls, and, most impressively, capped by a glass roof held aloft by said iron framing. But where Sips' structures would have saved a gold coin here and there by streamlining design choices and keeping things simple, Telesir seemed to do the exact opposite, finding it necessary to add flourishes every chance they got. From the volutes and flower motifs that capped the ends of every support beam, to the scrollwork that shielded the bottom and tops of each pillar, to even iron tendrils and vines that seemed etched into the very glass it was holding aloft, the message here was clear. The terminal, as was the case with many terminals on any self-replicating station back home, was an attempt to make a good first impression. It was a blatant display of culture, or simply wealth, in the case of the Nexus. Once more, the sheer number of copper-framed portals, compared to the measly pair at Sips, was a good enough indicator as to where Telesir stood in terms of his economic potential. Though, given the lack of any gold filigree, it was clear they probably weren't on Elisir's level just yet. To all pass-bearers, appointees, and privileged persons, please direct yourselves to the gilded ingress. A voice abruptly blared through the cavernous halls, as several attendants dressed in what I could only describe as a cross between Victorian butler wear and 18th century stagecoach attendants ushered the few privileged travellers towards a largely empty path. Come on, Emma, let's get moving, Thamin urged, as I followed him silently towards our privileged path. Despite the grandiose space the terminal took up, it was clear that it wasn't just for show, as was often the case at the Academy. Because here, the massive open concourses and wide halls actually served a purpose. Commerce. Though I guess you could argue the egos of Academy students necessitated just as much, if not more, space than carts, wagons and buggies. Speaking of which... Cart after cart passed us by, falling into their own neat little lanes demarcated not just by traffic lines, but by grooves carved into the tile and stone floors of the place. 3 such grooves existed in the same lane, allowing for 3 axle gorges to cohabit the same track towards the cargo checkpoint ahead. That little detail, while easily overlooked, conveyed so much in just one neat package, communicating to those observant of the Nexus's abilities for standardization on a truly universal level. Whilst not as strikingly impressive as the portals or the transportium itself, what it alluded to was just as important, if not arguably more important. Administrative planning, political will, and the organizational capital and competence required to carry out said will. It's one thing to have portals and impressive features en masse, I began softly, garnering Thamin's attention with a flick and a tilt of his perky triangular ears. Those are one-off wonders, the tools to get the job done. It's another thing entirely to be able to create the boring systems capable of utilizing said tools towards grand and consistent ends, I continued, pointing out the tracks and carts to Thamin. A simple idea,
Deceptively basic, honestly, but when applied to something as large, diverse, and packed with an impossible amount of variable factors as the Nexus, is nothing short of impressive. Standardization, especially on such a universal scale, is a hallmark of administrative competence.
The Nexus is nothing if not competent, Emma,
Thalmin conceded with a heavy breath.
You can be the most powerful mage in all of the realms. You can become the greatest conqueror known to history, but none of these achievements matter if you lack the pen bearers, paper pushers, and the foresight to consolidate your gains, to turn raw power and potential into something that truly lasts. The prince took a moment to crane his head upwards, letting out a sigh in the process. The Nexus may have an excess of ego and flawed nobility, but for every layabout lord there exists a prudent prince.
Lord Lesips proves as much, I guess, I admitted, garnering a nod from Thalmin.
But I do have hope, Thalmin subtly uttered, a privacy screen forming shortly thereafter. If Earthrealm's candidate finds this to be noteworthy, and resists the temptation to be enamored by the portals and the transportium network itself, then I do believe there exists an equally competent polity by virtue of your interests.
The same can be said about Havenbrock's current ruling family, I added. Overthrowing an incompetent regime that couldn't even perform the most basic functions of the state, paying your army, and actually being able to maintain a state on what I assume was a terrifying deficit. Now that's statesmanship that should be lauded in its own right. That little compliment definitely took Thalmin off guard, as he snickered and raised both arms proudly behind his head. I guess my prime did have a knack for competent rule, yes, he spoke boisterously. Well, you have to tell me more then, I urged, but stopped just as we reached the exit counter. Papers, please. The satyr attendant spoke politely, as we responded in kind to her request. The exchange of Chiska's field trip travel papers and a cursory glance at our vehicles were all that were needed before we were let through. Not even a baggage check was done, as we emerged through a set of stained glass double doors and into the wider world. However, what hit us first wouldn't be the grandeur of the town, nor the impressive scale of the buildings around us. Instead, it was what could only be described as a massive roadblock worth of vehicles, all of which were lined up bumper to fender, or in this case, horse to cart? They stretched all along the main cargo egress of the terminal, causing a traffic bottleneck of apocalyptic proportions. However, there was only one side of the story. The second would be the massive cart-spanning banners depicting wheat and flour, all with prices, offers, and what could only be described as an egregious amount of slag that all translated poorly or outright vulgarly, if the EV was to be trusted. The third, and probably most obnoxious thing about this, however, was the ear-splitting whistles, honks, yells, and screams of those standing atop these carts, all of which confirmed my suspicions of exactly what this was.
40th Millers! Deposit your grain at 40th Millers! We offer 20 times the asking price of the next miller. Just a 2-week wait for payout on milling. A red and yellow tunic-wearing elf yelled out at the top of his lungs, only to be beaten in sheer volume by a dwarf right next to him. Easil's Milling House. We buy all grain. Corn, wheat, corn. 1 silver for a bell load. 2 silvers for a promissory token. Though even that would pale in comparison to what came next, as a kobold dressed in what could only be described as a cross between jester, clown, and car salesman attire stood up proudly atop a dedicated crow's nest on his cart. Forget the competition! Have debts you need paid? Taxes you have owed? Family that will be whisked into the night if you don't make payments now? Well, come on down to Teva's Milling House. We don't just sign promissories. The kobold paused, gesturing to his satyr and dwarven helpers to haul sackfuls of coin, the likes of which caused the cart to tilt forward. We pay in coin upon purchase! All of these advertisements clearly worked on the still nauseous farmers that plodded out through the egress doors, as some seemed swayed by the promises of the elf's trustworthy offer. But most were quite predictably crowding around the red kobold's cart as a result of his boisterous promises. The wider trade dynamics of the Nexus, at least as it pertained to the Outlands, started to become clear to me here, as the winds of commerce and trade blew hard against the predictable choke points by which trade flowed. Huh, was all I could say, before we were stopped by tradesfolk of a different sort. Your Highnesses, your Majesties, by his eternal will, it is fate by which we were destined to meet.
please, we have the finest accommodations in all... A finely dressed elf offered, but was just as quickly pushed aside by another.
Your Highnesses, please, allow me to... No, thank you, Thalmin responded with a dulcet growl, completely taking the small crowd by surprise as they made way for us without a single word more. The Kelpie's death glare probably had a few things to do with that, though. Regardless, it was only when we broke free of the hotel offers, tour guides, souvenir peddlers, and knick-knack salesfolk that we finally made it out of the transport hub and into downtown proper. It was here that we were met with something genuinely missing from both of Ellis's districts, commoner and ambassadorial: scale. Ellisir was quite obviously a sort of college town. Its size, while perhaps impressive by Sips's standards, was quite honestly lacking. Telesir, by contrast, was what I'd expected of Ellisir upon first hearing of it. There were 4 wide boulevards, each with 3 lanes divided in half by planters and streetlights. These rows of magical concrete and asphalt all led the way to a massive circular roundabout, which in itself encircled a town square and the city's centerpiece, an obelisk soaring about as high as the Washington Monument. Atop of it was a sort of beacon, one that pulsated and glowed, drawing all sorts of stone golems to circle it. Moreover, it was here in the wide open avenues that we were able to finally see the skies proper, at which point I couldn't help but to be quite intrigued at what I saw. I'd assumed they were just flocks of birds at first. However, upon closer view, courtesy of the Eevee's sensors, I saw them for what they were. Drakes. Mounted drakes, to be precise, each of which was decked in armor and other magical gear, as well as what happened to be some sort of magical weapons, complements, or at least cargo, strapped to the underside near the base of their wings. These drake riders were kitted with plate armor that seemed to glow against the afternoon sun, complete with decorative wings that fluttered against the wind, as they ducked and weaved in patterns that not a single citizen down below seemed to pay any mind to. However, the presence of these riders was promptly explained by the litany of public notices and posters scattered around storefronts, billboards, and public notice boards. Though these too were supplemented by the presence of what could only be described as town criers, many of whom stood atop plinths, concentrated most prominently in the town square that we just so happened to be passing through. In keeping with the promises of the Crown to all of its subjects, the Privy Council has dispatched Sky Wardens of the Skyward Spire upon Ethelcid to patrol the town's perimeter. There shall be no incursions for the likes of the fabled Amethyst Dragon, and rest assured our lords are more than capable of downing a measly sundered beast. The rotund crier bellowed out loudly, just as one of his 2 attendants reached for another scroll, unfurling it for their boss to read. Hear ye, hear ye! Today's public bread has been graciously provided by the bountiful surplus of the Brotherhood of Millers under Baron Quaff Sips. The Brotherhood of Millers uses only the finest grain, true Nexian bread for true Nexians.
I couldn't help but blink curiously at that last announcement, but just as quickly moved on from the town square and onto another boulevard, leading straight to the town's exit. Along the way, we encountered more evidence of the town's impressive prosperity, from its bustling streets to its dense yet well-kept buildings. However, as we reached the halfway point out of town, we fast approached a construct that would come to dominate the local skyline. It was a stadium, or more accurately, an amphitheatre, giving off some massive Colosseum vibes. The ovoid structure rose high above the 4-story mid-rises in this district of the city, its shadow casting upon much of the boulevard, even at a fairly respectable distance. Indeed, the placement of the structure didn't seem to be random, as the boulevard purposefully veered towards one of its grand entrances, even going so far as to route much of its path along one of the oval structure's sides. It was here that passers-by were able to glance at not only the posters on display, but also the impressive floor-to-ceiling glass outcropping, featuring ample views into what signs referred to as the Hall of Heroes. This proved to be the site of an unexpected reunion, as the both of us came to an abrupt stop simultaneously, our eyes meeting with the very person who sent us out on this quest. Or at least, a stone and marble facsimile of her. Quickly dismounting, we approached the glass outcropping, putting our faces close against it to confirm if this truly was who we thought it was. The nameplate at the bottom of the statue's plinth was enough to dispel any and all doubts, however, as Thalmin turned towards me with an amused expression. Lady Chiska Malamont, the hero of Hervahale, Grand Champion of the Drake Riders Table of Transgratia, Honorary Skywarden and Grand Master of the Drake Riders Hunting Club. Victor of the Telesir Drake Riding Championship for 20 consecutive years. Thalmin read out, before stopping as the next part of the text was just too small from where we stood. The EV made short work of it, however, as I quickly read it out. Quote, "It got boring after the first 10 years. We both turned to one another after that, each of us cracking a smile and shrugging in unison. What a legend! We both spoke simultaneously, resulting in a uniform chuckle between us. Out of all of the professors, I think Professor Chiska's the only one to really deserve our respect, Thalmin offered. Along with Sorosar, of course, I immediately added. I stand corrected, but you know what I meant, he acknowledged, before promptly returning to the Kelpie. A few curious onlookers had finally gathered around our respective conveyances by that point, though many seemed to be more interested in the V4C than the Kelpie, and probably for good reason. The beast looked about ready to tear into the bystanders at the slightest hint of provocation. The crowd quickly scattered as we arrived. However, a few children were brave enough to remain, each of them addressing me with their own little questions. What's that? A small elf questioned, pointing at the gun emblem Sorosar had taken the liberty of personally forging for the front of the motorcycle. Is that a family crest? Are you an adjacent realmer? A 3-foot-tall mannequin spoke out, and a very painted one at that. A greater slime child, I figured. A grey-furred buxy kid had the nonchalant sense to run a pointed claw on the leg of my suit, squinting at the lack of any scratch made. Why are you wearing weird armour? I took a moment to crouch down to their level, garnering several quizzical looks from parents and bystanders alike. That, I pointed to the emblem, is my realm's emblem. And yes, I am an adjacent realmer. As for why I'm wearing weird armour? Well, I guess you could say it's a nightly vow of sorts, I explained jovially, garnering a series of oohs and ahs. I took that as my opportunity to get out of dodge, as Thalmin and I quickly mounted back up and began our rapid escape out of the town's limits. The boulevard never once narrowed even as we reached the outskirts of town, where building height and density grew increasingly more modest. One would have expected this to result in a decrease of traffic, but that was hardly the case. Carts carrying ore, produce, and a whole host of mystery boxes continued to funnel through the boulevard, keeping it relatively full in one way or another. It took us a good half hour, but we finally made it to a tavern by the town walls. There we took a moment to regain our bearings, the town guards regarding us with two simple nods as they both raised their gates, without much fanfare.
Are my lord's academy students, perchance?
Yep, that's us, I acknowledged with a smile.
To serve my laws is to serve my own lord. The dwarf bowed deeply. You may pass. Although, and with no authority of my own, I must convey this notice on behalf of my lord and the lords above him. Avoid the North Rivian forests. They are currently off limits, the guard warned, as the both of us nodded firmly in response. You got it, sir, I beamed. We soon made our way across the small moat encircling the town without much fanfare, hopping right back on the royal roads and taking the path charted for us by Sim's adventuring troupe. So, I turned to Thalmin, after a good few minutes of silence. Thankfully we seem to have avoided all the side quests in town. I chuckled before turning to the quest timer, which means we're more or less back on schedule, since I kind of factored in the potential for time wasting over in Telesir. Thalmin nodded wordlessly at this, his focus seemingly tied once again to the Kelpie. So, have you thought of a name for them yet? For the Kelpie?
Yeah, I acknowledged.
No.
Do you mind if I suggest one? Thalmin's eyes narrowed at this, as if waiting for some joke to drop.
Go on.
So, you know you had Emberstride, right?
Yes.
Well, I was thinking, wouldn't it be thematic and on-brand if we went with Aquastride? I offered frankly. This caused Thalmin's features to simply stiffen into a neutral, inquisitive one.
Isn't that rather on the nose, Emma?
I mean, it just fits, right? Emberstride's fire-based, and with the Kelpie being a water-based creature, why not Aquastride? The Lupinor went silent before letting out a long, tired sigh, coupled with a dismissive laugh.
I'll consider it, Emma, if you consider naming your by-treader Lightning Tread.
Why? I shot back.
Because that's as silly as your own proposal for...
Done.
Wait, what?
Done. Lightning Tread is badass, Thalmin. Thanks, I beamed. It's better than just calling it the V4C all the time, after all, I beamed, before shifting confidently into a menacing grin. But now the ball's in your court. Are we going with Aquastride?
Thalmin went silent at that, grumbling as he sighed and shrugged. Give me a few more hours to decide, at least. I'm not drunk enough for this.
Deal.
The Transgration Academy for the Magical Arts. The Gardens. Local time, 1700 hours.
Ilpheus. I was angry, but I wasn't foolish. Ladona was trying to use me, that slimy, squirmy insect of a noble. Yet, I couldn't deny that she was right in so many ways. Lord Athonian was a spineless carpet of a man, and I needed to act on my own behalf if I am to seize my own destiny. The New Realmers group have been living in a delusion of invincibility, enjoying the good hand fate seems to be adamant on providing for them, which was precisely why they needed to be reminded of their frailty. Ah, fancy meeting you here, Lady Aerith. What do you want, Lady Iphias? Melissa Avenor sniped down any and all pretenses of polite conversation, letting her peer group's laurels lift her up through no effort of her own. I simply wish to talk, to discuss the matter of a certain New Realmer. Well, she's not here, and I have no desire to act as a pawn in whatever game of subterfuge you have up your sleeves. The Shatter Realmer stood firm, her eyes poised on her nails rather than my gaze. She might not be here, but her peers certainly are. I jumped straight into the bait, laying it out bluntly for the lesson Avenor. A certain greater avid... I felt the air around me suddenly thin, as in a matter of seconds, our gazes were locked without any semblance of civility. Choose your next words carefully, Lady Iphias, Aerith seethed. I'm merely proposing an alliance of opportunity, Lady Aerith. I managed out, as I subtly attempted to shoot back counterspell after counterspell to little effect. The muscle of the group is missing, and all that remains are the two weakest links. You know this, and I wish to reiterate this just in case... What? Just in case I cave and become a pawn in your games? Need I remind you, Lady Iphias, that I am not struggling at the bottom of the peer group ladder? I have all to lose, but you have all to gain. Be grateful I am even spelling this out for your sorry soul, she seethed, before finally letting up on whatever spell she cast around me. I took in deep breaths, my eyes burning with frustration. Fight your own fights, or better yet, give me a proposal worth listening to, she added dismissively, as I finally felt the air thicken once more, allowing me to properly gasp for breath. You have a day, and no more. Now go. She raised a wing, shooing me as she dismissed me. Me? Lady Iphias of... You can internally monologue your defeat elsewhere. That clouded mind of yours is ruining a perfectly fine evening.